Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My dear friends, it's good to be with you. I hope you are doing very, very well, your side. So I want to raise the question of nativism and how the contemporary Islamic sect of Salafism in fact represents a nativist expression. Now let me first explain to you what I mean by nativism. What nativism is a collective yearning or a collective hankering of a people in crisis generally to a glorious past. And so the way they imagine an liberation from that anguish or crisis is a simplistic collective understanding that all that needs to be done is simply to duplicate or replicate all decisions, all actions, all beliefs, all practices, all institutions of a distant past, to in fact resuscitate those and to then in that way establish or re-establish the glory amongst them. And so nativism is sort of like a belief that by recreating the past, one can in fact achieve true liberation and greatness. But you know, a historian was a historian also in his own right. He was a dialectical historian. Karl Marx, he said back in the 1800s, he said that history only repeats itself as a farce. And by looking at many cases in history, it draws that conclusion that when people try to recreate the past, if people try to duplicate a previous era by simply in a unthinking or a thoughtless way reinstituting the same practices and beliefs, what they get is only a farce. It's a shadow. It's a comical shadow of the past. And he was in fact referring particularly to the second Napoleon. You know, there was a great Napoleon Bonaparte that lived and that conquered at the end of the 18th century and at the early decade of the 19th century. But few people realize that there was also a Napoleon that ruled France around the mid-1800s, about 30 or 40 years after the first Napoleon, who really can only be understood as a farcical imitation of the earlier Napoleon, because there was no greatness, there was no history, there was no conquest. All there was just a guy that was trying to steal or to ride on the reputation of the previous Napoleon. So why am I raising this idea of nativism? You see, we have to deal with it ourselves as a scholar myself, as a reader of coloniality, of colonial history. I do make mention of the idea of nativism in my work, in my thesis particularly, and I raise it as sort of a false or a fallacious attempt at decolonizing a people, a fallacious attempt at decoloniality, because it really, by applying the practices of the past in a thoughtless, in a unthinking way, in a blind and dumb way, all you can achieve is just a joke. You can never achieve anything without thoughtfully and without rationally instituting various practices and beliefs and institutions in a time that you exist in. Because times change, nature changes, other peoples change, the environment changes. And so we have to create an order based on the unique time and space that we find ourselves in. Now, Salafism commits that supreme fallacy It is the belief of the Salafist priest, the Salafist scholar within the contemporary Islamic society, that by only going back 1400 years to a time of the Prophet, which was impossible to meticulously record. Of course, there were no recorders, video cameras, closed circuit television. There were none of those, any of those material and equipment. There was no internet. And so to recreate the life of the Prophet, alayhi salam, Muhammad, even though it sounds like a worthwhile and a sort of valuable endeavor, you cannot but create a patchwork of the life of the Prophet. It is impossible to go back 300 years and to dig up the context and the content of every moment in the Prophet's life. You know for yourself today that if somebody tries to recreate the life of, let's take your parent, your mother, your father, whoever raised you. If you try and recreate independently after their death every major moment in their lives, you will never be able to make sense of each and every decision. I'm a fairly grown man, and I've made many decisions in my life. And some of those decisions were extremely based on a very nuanced reality that faced me. You know, by going into a particular business, by allowing my daughter a particular, permission that she asked me at a certain point in her young years, how I dealt with my sons, my interpersonal relationships with friends, the points where I went to battle, the points where I chose not to go to battle with in certain environments. Those are all based on extremely nuanced, complex, complicated factors. The context was very complex, very complicated, and I would hate for my son to do a simplistic one-to-one comparison and to say one day to his children, look, my dad did this, and so we do that. We do it that way. And that is really what the Salafist is trying to do. The Salafist is trying to recreate the life of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. He really believes that recreating the history, the past of the Prophet and the immediate successors to him, that you can in fact establish a perfect society. Now, my brothers and sisters, there is no sense in that. It makes no sense unless you believe that you will miraculously have the hand of God that will bless you and that will magically make such a dumb decision result in a flourishing, successful society. It cannot happen. It has been tried. It has been tried before. Afghanistan tried it. Pakistan early on tried it. There are places throughout the Middle East. Who is the emperor that succeeded Akbar the Great, the third emperor in the Mughal? They tried it. They tried it, my friends. Through 14 centuries, Muslims tried to recreate, to reinstitute magically the world that the Prophet experienced. The world in the year 500 or 610 Common Era. You cannot recreate that world, my friends. We have a radically different world. That was a world where I think the population of the whole planet Earth was something like 500 million. The population, technology was non-existent. Cultures and intercultural engagement was non-existent. The way that people thought, the way they acted, the slavery was the norm. And so what you are trying to say, this, I'm talking to the Salafist now, what the Salafist is arguing is that we should just bring back lock, stock and barrel, bring the slavery back, bring the tortures back, bring the mutilation of the corpses back, bring every conceivable horror, bring that all back, and we will have a successful and happy society. Now that only makes sense in the mind of a nut, in the mind of a nativist who really has some magical belief that in bringing back a previous era can work in a contemporary situation. That is not how Islam works, my dear friends. That is not how Islam works. You see, you can bring back the Qur'an. The noble Qur'an is relivable. It is, you can rehash, you can reprocess the Qur'an. By reprocessing, I mean you can reread the Qur'an at every era and at every stage in history. And if you read in the Qur'an and it says that you shall be kind to the orphan, it is a timeless statement. Where the Qur'an says you shall deal kindly with your spouse, it is a timeless statement. When the Qur'an says that you should free one in bondage, it is a timeless statement, because bondage is still around. We have debt slaves today. We have slaves in whatever way, sex slaves, human trafficking, indentured labor. So when the Qur'an makes its divine and profound claims from one cover to the next cover to the end, every verse in the Qur'an is repeatable, rehashable, reprocessable, and we can make sense of it at any time in history. Not so with hadith. Not so with the decisions of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. He had the Quran, he had the text, the Mus'haf, and he applied the Mus'haf rationally, sensibly, to the unique, nuanced context which faced him. And so when the Quran says, go to war against those who fight you, he chose the right moment. He chose the right means. He chose the right strategy. And then he implemented those verses. The same with us. When the Quran says, go to war with those who are at war with you, we have to choose our strategy, our battlefield, our time, our means of mobilization, our type of warfare. We cannot simply repeat verbatim or try to repeat verbatim or in detail the way the Prophet gave vent or gave meaning to those verses. At every era and at every time, at every place, we need to read the Quran for our situation. That's the beauty, the power of the book. Now, what we have in Salafism is an attempt to tell you that stop thinking and go and dig out hadiths. Dig out hadiths, 10,000, 20,000 hadiths, and find for every situation. And believe me, it is really a joke. Let's say, for example, we have the situation of a space traveler, person going in the International Space Station, a person sitting in there. And yes, flat earthers, it's time for you to switch off, change channels. So the space station Um, how do you make salah? They, there are no hadiths. So you cannot recreate every situation. You cannot. It's impossible. How do you deal with a Muslim living in a powerful but just and fair country? Let's take an example, maybe, I'm not sure, let's say South Africa. Let's say South Africa is a country where Muslims are free, able to do anything, to be in government, to live as they please. How does the hadith relate to us in South Africa? Do we have to go and kill Christians? Do we have to go to a war with Jewish people who have done us no harm? It's absolutely nonsensical to say to people that take the hadith and apply it 100%. It's impossible. And when you try to do that, all you end up with is a complete and utter mess. So I'm saying to you today that Salafism is the nativist expression of Islam in our times. It is trying to say to you that you can create a perfect Muslim or a perfect Islamic order by just going cutting and pasting the year 610. It's impossible, my friends. What we need is, we need to become a knowledge society. We Muslims, mu'minun, we need to become a society of knowledge. We need to surpass the West in our thirst and in our hunger for knowledge. And what is knowledge? Knowledge is knowing. Knowledge means knowing. And our knowledge, and another word for knowledge is the word science. We need to surpass the West in terms of understanding, knowledge, science. So in other words, when it comes to any aspect of life, when it comes to health, we need to surpass the West in what is good in terms of our health, the health of humanity. When it comes to the environment, we need to surpass the West in terms of what is good for the environment and what is bad for the environment. Objective knowledge should be our business. And that is how you recreate a great and brilliant civilization, is through knowledge, through thinking, through aql, through contemplation. And all the time the book of God, the Qur'an, the noble set of parameters, the wisdom of the book is there as a framework, as a container, as something that prevents you from going off into directions that are of no use, that are pointless. And so that is the book. The book is the hudud, the parameters, the wisdom, the ancient examples. And that is the role of the book. But knowledge is an endeavor, it is an activity that we should excel in. And anyone that tells you now that knowledge, you can gain it from the West, and your religion, your greatness and your power and your glory will come from Islam, they're talking nonsense. There is no glory, there is no power, there is no global leadership without knowledge, without understanding. And you couple that knowledge, that truth, that understanding, you couple it with all the other beautiful parameters which the Quran gives you. The parameters of kindness, the parameters of compassion, the parameters of truth, the parameters of courage and valor, the parameters of jihad, of martyrdom, of standing up against anyone that tries to block or to distract from your truth and from your knowledge. And so that, my friends, is the only pathway to greatness. Not trying to repeat the way that the Prophet went to the toilet, the way the Sahabis used to talk to each other, and the way they gave each other nicknames, and the type of shoes they wore, and the type of jokes they made. And my friends, that is a pathway to nowhere. It is a pathway to nowhere. Let us agree that we shall become a ummah, a people of knowledge, a people of truth. And then there will come greatness. Alhamdulillah.